Hi, I'm Zach, and I guide the work at Agora Academy. My work centers around soul maturation, initiation, wilderness rites of passage, pilgrimage, and through mythology and storytelling and history and cosmology, I hope to initiate a conversation around our deepest aspects of our soul, the mysteries of nature and psyche. So today I'm taking a pause, or this month I'm taking a pause on my monthly myth writing, and I wanted to showcase an exhibit that was in Quito, Ecuador. I just had the privilege of leading a tour to. And so this presentation is around Andean religious thought and five key understandings. So this topic is near and dear to my heart, and I think it's going to be a beautiful time for us to dive deep within these power objects. So, nestled in the historic district of the capital city of Ecuador, Quito is this beautiful, beautiful museum with a really special mission. I've spent a lot of time in museums around the world, and I've never encountered anything like this. And this is why I wanted to do this presentation. Casa del Alabado, meaning house of praise, house of worship, house of devotion, is a pre Columbian art museum. And there are many pre Columbian art museums. Pre Columbian meaning before the Spanish came and the conquest of Latin America, Central America, South America. So these are the indigenous tribes and cultures and civilizations and empires and their artwork. That's this period. This museum is super special. Not only is it immaculately designed and beautiful curation, but the mission centers the spiritual, religious, ceremonial, ritual objects. Unlike lots of other museums that center the art or the technique, um, this museum is special because it centers the ceremonial piece of these cultures, and that is their religion, their spirituality, their cosmology is really important. So I want to invite you to consider that these artifacts are messengers from the past, like arrows sent by ancestors to awaken us. An interest in their world and their thinking. These objects have power to stimulate appreciation, surprise, pleasure, and curiosity. So, on with the show. So, as a historian, a mythologist, and lover of indigenous wisdom traditions and pre Columbian art, it was really fun to be able to lead a tour on the one day that I was in Quito at this museum, Casa del Alabado. And so in October, just a few weeks ago, I led a 4 hour tour through the whole museum, and it was really beautiful. Special shout out and thanks to Prince McGowan, friend and photographer, who took these beautiful photos throughout the tour. And I wanted to share this presentation as a gift to my friends and family and those who are interested in cosmology and mythology, and especially in Andean worldviews. So this is an invitation to explore how these ancient artifacts stir something within each of us, that they each hold power in their own way. And they echo a worldview in which material and immaterial are together. That there isn't this separation between the material world and the material world, that they both desire our relationship. I hope you are enjoying the soundscape. This music is provided by Cabo at worldmusicsamples.com. It was a beautiful curation of instruments and voices and cantos from all over Central and South America. So, shout out there. I wanted to organize this presentation in a slightly different way than the thematic structure that the museum offered. I wanted to offer 5 key principles, cosmological principles of how the Andean people viewed their worldview. The Andean people, by the way, are modern day Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Bolivia, and northern Chile. But almost all of these artifacts are coming from Ecuador itself. So these principles, these 5 principles, one being the existence of 3 parallel worlds organized by a central axis. The 3 parallel worlds are the upper world, the middle world, the lower world. The second is the role of humans in connecting with sacred forces. Through this is the role of the elite, how they sponsored art and religious feasts and offerings and sacrifice. And the class of the shaman, who, controversial word, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But the Andean people had a whole totality of religious specialists, including healers and poets and prophets and priests. The third being the spiritual power of matter, that all matter comes from Pachamama, Mother Earth, and is already imbued with vital life energy force. 4, the role of death and fertility in rituals, that death and life, birth, fertility, abundance, be it childbirth or be it agricultural production, they're tied with our rituals of and deep reverence for death. And 5, the role of feasts, sacrifices, and offerings in continuing this dynamic flow of life force. So let's get into the first theme. The first theme is the existence of 3 parallel worlds organized by a central axis. So there are 3 interconnected worlds. Now, there's some speculation about this. Many believe that this is coming from the later indigenous wisdom traditions, like the Inca, or before that. We're not entirely sure if all the oldest tribes and traditions in the Andean region have these same sort of orderly structure, but this is what we're going for with right now. So the world of the above, Hanapacha, the world below, Ukapacha, and the earthly world, Kaipacha. These realms are not isolated, but they flow together through a central axis, generally like a tree or a pillar of a house or a temple, or an axis like a mirror, or other portals like caves and springs. But people could access the central channel, this thread, and be able to traverse between the upper, the middle, and the lower worlds. And being able to do this created harmony, and that's how you did your work. It's how you did your spiritual practice of maintaining harmony across all of existence. I think it's important to note here, too, that these 3 worlds were interconnected, and the primary purpose of every individual, every tribe, every family unit, every empire was to maintain the flow of life. And you did that by holding offerings and feasts and by your practice. It was through our reverence, our song, our prayer, our offerings to the other worlds that they fed us, and in return we feed them. So Martin Prechtel talks about this a lot in his work from the Tutequila Maya in Guatemala, around the idea that like we feed the holy and the holy then feeds us. There's a reciprocity. In Andean traditions, it's called Aini, reciprocity, that what we give to the other world, they give back to us. So here's our first artifact, and you can see in all of art is a spiritual aspect. These artists were highly specialized. Artists had to have a level of spiritual maturity before they became true artisans, because true artisans are regenerative of culture, and they renew culture. So this is a spiral vase, and it's a ceramic vessel. It would have held offerings like chicha, corn beer, or other liquids that could have been poured for libations. And what's interesting about this one is the patterns of the spiral. The spiral is this representation. It's not even just metaphoric. It is. The indigenous sort of held at this point that, like, it's not a metaphor. It is. The spiral is the vital energy that the Andean cultures sought to harmonize. Um, so again, every person and every system, level of nested systems of society would have been focused on maintaining this vital energy. And that is what sustained life on planet Earth. Here again in the ceremonial plate, you see the representation of three worlds, the upper, lower, and middle, with the lines in between the plate, or in between the worlds on the plate, is that vital energy again. And in the center of the plate, you see a central access portal. So these ceramic molds are also created by coastal people of present-day Ecuador. This is around the idea of, just as there is an upper world, middle world, and lower world, the cosmos is structured. There's a form to cosmology. That there is also internal and external. So each of us contain both these three worlds in ourselves. Our cultures do, our world does, and internally we have an internal and external world. So the Andean people understood that duality was essential for the flow of life. Yes, there is unification. Yes, there is oneness. But there's structure and order to things. And part of that comes from learning duality and the understanding of duality. And then eventually quadrality. So you'll see a lot of times in their art has this like sort of unification theme, and then there's a dual theme, and then there's then the two is split into four or into many. So duality being these two bifurcated poles of both order and chaos, masculine and feminine, light and darkness, life and death, growth and fertility and decay and decomposition, of progress and ambition, and then of rest and silence and rejuvenation. And so these great tensions are essential to the flow of life. We're not trying to master them or get above them, but the Andean idea was that we learn how to go between them when we need to. And so a lot of times in their art, like this two-headed vessel, you'll see duality depicted. And then the two became four. In this water vessel, there are four sides to it. And this represents, in Andean art, that duality often evolves into quadrality, into diversity. And diversity ecologically is essential for health and vibrancy, vitality of any living ecosystem is diversity. So this reflects the four cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, and the elemental forces, which were the primordial forces of life. So being able to balance the elements of wind, fire, water, and earth, north, south, east, and west in each of us is what it means to be centered and balanced. Here's an offering table. It was most likely an incense burner or a place to put offerings of coca leaves or tobacco. And this offering table has the three worlds in it embodied into it. So the upper, the middle, and the lower in those three sections. And it's through ritual and through offering that individuals maintain balance by honoring these three forces of the upper, the lower, and the middle worlds. And by feeding through offering and ritual, in turn, they sustained and nourished life. Again, in these house sculptures, you see, even in the structure of a house, in the Andean cosmos, the basement was the underworld, the living space was the middle world, and the roof symbolized the upper realms. Not every house had a basement or an attic, but in their sculptures and their artwork and in temple structures, they remind us that even in our houses and temples, they're mirrored of the harmony between these spiritual, earthly, and ancestral worlds. And then that portal I was talking about, here's a really beautiful effigy. It depicts a high priest crowned with 4 points. You see the chakana, the Andean cross, in both like the red and the red negative painting and the white painting, the duality again, and then the 4 directions of the cross, and then in the center of the cross is the axis mundi, a sacred portal that connected the spiritual and the earthly realms. Again, this portal is where how individuals and spiritual teachers and religious thinking understood that like this is how you access those 3 worlds. It could be through a tree or through a cave or through even a column in your house or in your temple. That there were sacred spaces that acted as portals to these other realms. On to section number 2. This is the role of the humans in connecting with sacred forces. So this idea that the role of the human, part of the role of what it meant to be fully a mature and regenerative adult in society, was to connect and have personal relationships with sacred forces. And in Andean culture, it was the role of the individual, it was the role of the family, it was the role of society through temples and through religious specialists and everyone. And the whole society was responsible for maintaining the flow of vital energy life force. That life flowed when there was good reciprocity between this world and that world. And so societies in the Andes relied on ritual and ceremonies and religious specialists like priests and healers and poets and diviners to maintain this connection to the spiritual world. The goal was power in some way, not power over, but power with, ultimately and hopefully. And that was your marker if you were a healthy and integrated person, that if you were able to use this power to benefit all of society and the land and the village, you wanted to influence cosmic forces. You wanted to ensure the protection from harmful energies to your village and to your family and to your society. And you wanted to promote the well-being of the people in the land. So in our first piece in this section, number 2, is this spiral-shaped whistle bottle. And you can see the negative painting on it, the carving out of the ceramic clay underneath, and then the painting on top. The spiral sort of wrapping up represent this life force, this primordial, chaotic, and orderly life force that comes from source. And this is the energy that's being harnessed by these religious specialists and by individuals and by everyone in society. And so this is a whistle bottle. This would have lived on family tables, and everyday rituals would have been at dinner time, at breakfast time, and you would fill it with like chicha, which is like a corn beer, and you would pour libations in the ground for the ancestors. And then later, when this owner, this family member died, this would have been buried with them, ensuring that there was a connection between the realms. Here you have another example of this primordial, chaotic, and orderly vital life force that flows in these like lines in this vessel. It's a labyrinth. Again, everyday objects were art and ceremonial and religious. They were not just symbolic, they believed that they contained the actual primordial force within these objects. And so offerings and ceremonies would have happened offerings would have happened right in these vessels during ceremonies. And families would have directed this flow of energy between worlds, ensuring that their family, their individual prosperity, and communal prosperity. A really interesting aspect was this whole exhibit around deformed individuals. So here are three different sculptures, pre-Columbian Andean culture sculptures of deformed individuals. So it was believed that deformed individuals, or people who had gender fluidity, who were gay or straight, or bisexual, or androgynous, had mental differences, or physical deformities, were often seen as they were given an elevated role in society, because they were seen to have more special connection with the spirit realms. And their heightened sensitivity was seen as a gift, allowing them to maintain this vital connection between the human and spiritual world. So I thought there was an interesting aspect that really speaks to like where in our society, in contemporary and modern society, do we, how do we treat um, people who have heightened sensitivity? So, no one religious specialist. So, the word shaman is a Western term, but we use it anthropologically to describe like a whole host of spiritual specialists. Indian cultures would have never called their religious specialists shamans. It's just a way that we as Westerners summarize that term. But they had a whole host of different specialists: doctors, poets, scientists, diviners, sages, psychics, ceremonial leaders, healers. All of them were religious specialists. And they were responsible for maintaining this link between the human and the spiritual world. They served as guides, as protectors, as healers and teachers. They helped the dead pass. They were custodians of ancient knowledge. And they regularly worked with sacred plants like the ayahuasca, the wachuma, the coca, the tobacco. And they went into altered states of consciousness. And this was not seen as recreational, this was seen as religious, to build allyship and relationship with these plant spirits who taught them in return the skills they needed in their individual practices. So there was this whole exhibit, this whole thematic section in the museum around the role of the shaman. In this shamanic bird figure, um, there was this old idea that shamans, through their allies, could transform. So this particular shaman, this would have been an actual effigy. This would have been a sculptor. A sculptor would have made this from an actual shaman, a religious specialist during that day. This would have been buried with them. This would have been on their altar. And this particular shaman probably had a relationship with a bird. And birds represent, they were messengers to the upper worlds. And so this particular shaman was a specialist in upper world, um, and could mediate between these realms and guiding their people with unseen forces to maintain spiritual harmony through his unique niche, which was the upper world. In these three different objects, number one, you have another transfiguration into a jaguar. The jaguar is a very powerful animal, spirit ally of the middle world. And in number two, you have an underworld um, transfigured shaman. He or she would go into the underworld and do things like retrieve lost soul parts, sutro, or connect historical memory or creativity, all things governed by the underworld. And sometimes there's monsters down there, and you need to have a little bit more force. So a lot of the underworld ones are a lot more like underworldly monstery art. And number three is two shamans, religious specialists, who are chewing coca. Coca was a plant that was deeply revered by the Indian society, a master plant, and the ritual chewing and smoking of coca could put someone into an altered state where they could perform their magic for society. Um, Here are two other examples of shaman figures in ritual. Number one, there's this shaman. He or she has his fingers rested, which meant in Indian art, it was a symbol to say that this person had a special relationship with the jaguar and could transform into the jaguar for the benefit of society. And number two was this everyday household man who was a shaman in his own family, who sat on a column chewing coca and opening his arms to the duality of this vital life energy force, and was able to maintain harmony for his family through his spiritual devotion and religious practice. Then there's this whole section on the elite. The elite, this was such a fascinating part of the museum. The elite had a very special role in society um, that's very different and counter to how the elite operate in a modern society today. They did have privilege, but with that privilege came deep responsibility. In Andean society, they were expected and responsible for sponsoring public ritual, ceremonies, warfare, theater. They used their wealth for the betterment of society if they were in good harmonics. Um, if they were out, they went of harmonics, they would use their wealth and status for personal ambition or political ambition. But good, mature, embodied elites were seen in society as being stewards of custodialship. And so they sponsored most of this art in the museum was mostly paid for by the elite. And that was seen as a gift for all of society to benefit from. So, art in this context is not just decorative, but it's sacred. There's a bond between the elite and society. When the elite failed at their duties and they prioritized their personal ambition instead of harmony between this world and that, um, it was believed that cosmic imbalance would follow. So things like drought and plague and civil unrest and certain types of war were seen as signs that the elite were prioritizing their own ambition over their duty and responsibility as, as, as stewards of culture and society. So this gold headplate was an elite sponsored work. And yes, there is hierarchy in elite society or in Andean society, but hierarchy doesn't necessitate inequality in the way that I think postmodern thinkers think it as. So here's a beautiful example of craftsmanship in this monolith. Several 4,000 year old monolith. It embodies a primordial ancestor spirit. It's carved from stone. Stone was seen as one of the most powerful materials coming from our most ancient brother and sister, the mountains. It's minimalist form. It only has like sensory portals, like eyes and nose and head and feet. These were seen as gateways into the other worlds. These monoliths are shaped like this and would have just been dug right into the side of a mountain or an apu or a sacred site. And chicha, blood, tobacco, plants would have been offerings would have been poured directly onto this monolith. Again, this monolith it embodies the primordial forces. So it's human-ish, but it has some other aspects to it. Okay, here's a metal tray. A metal tray, lots of metal in today's world. But if we go back to Indian culture, it's not just metal was like rare because they didn't have the technology. It's because metal was rare because of the significance and the spiritually expensive nature of making metal. Metal was super expensive. Um, Spiritually, because in order to get this metal tray, you had to extract ore from mountains. Those mountains are spirits. Those That ore is spirit, and so that required reciprocity. It required an exchange, an offering of song or tobacco or a ritual of some sort. It required a hot fire to smelt, with the shaping of hammers and the burning of wood. That wood came from trees, animate life. That fire is an animate force. It's alive. The hammer is also a tool that is alive. So the hammer, the wood, the fire all required also offering. And so people were a lot more careful of how they kept their objects, how they took care of them. Um, in fact, one of the most significant roles of a shaman in society was to be the finder of lost objects, because objects had a ton of spiritual power. Unlike today, where we often just like cast things away into the trash. In Andean thought, silver channeled lunar energy of the moon, while gold embodied the power of the sun. Similar here. Here are gold and silver nose rings, mostly probably likely worn by the elite, the priests, the warriors, the artisans. Um, Again, it wasn't metaphoric that gold represented the sun. It was that gold was the embodied sense of sun itself. So wearing it, you were carrying the power of the sun on you. So matter is sacred, directly connected to the cosmos. Here you have three shamanic tools. These are mortars. They would have been the number one and number three are mortars. You would have put visionary substances and plants like ayahuasca or wachuma or coca, tobacco, or other plants, and you would have like grinded them down. And then number two was an inhalant. It was an applicator. You could put the shaman would put it in their nose and inhale ritually again these substances that would lead them into altered states so they could perform their religious niche, their specialty. It could be healing, it could be prophecy, it could be even inspiration as an artist. To be inspired, it means to be in spirit. And one of the ways that people in Andean cultures became in spirit was through plant substances. Not recreational, but religious. Here's a ritual object that most of you would probably be familiar with. It's obsidian with its deep black hue. It was often used as a shamanic tool as a portal to the underworld. This is the realm of power, of transformation, of fertility, of death, of regeneration, of renewal. And it's very distinct from Western notions of evil. It wasn't until late Christianity that there was this division between the upper world and middle world, one being heaven and the other being hell, and one being of punishment and torment, and the other one being of freedom and liberation. In Andean cultures, there wasn't this notion of like a dark, well, it was a dark underworld, but the darkness wasn't seen as evil. And many of the most powerful and also good healing shamans had to do their work in the underworld, and so they had to have relationships with underworld beings. Um, yes, it was filled with monsters, and yes, it was a harrowing place. Um, but when the collective healing required a journey into the underworld for guiding souls through death's passage, or the rites of initiation of the young, or this idea of soul loss, of sutro, these are all underworld tasks. And so these stones were revered as tools for recovering what was lost. For our fourth section, the role of death and fertility in rituals. This is one of my favorites because we have such a hard relationship with death in the modern world. It's something ugly to be avoided, something to be afraid of, deeply uncomfortable, something to be dressed up in formal attire, um, something left only to certain professionals. In Indian cultures, death and fertility were super connected. The way that you treated your dead and held your own impending death was directly connected to fertility, of birth, and the abundance of life in the living world. Let's go back to this word aini, or sacred reciprocity. The way I hear most contemporary people talk about it is in the form of a monetary exchange for goods or services. And sure, that may be one level of it, but a much deeper understanding in the cosmology of the Andeans was this feeding, that everything in life feeds and is eaten in return at some point. And that feeding cycle is what continues part of the vital life energy force and continuity of life. The dead weren't necessarily seen as apart from the system either. So, in pre Columbian belief, ancestors inhabited the underworld, and they offered protection and they ensured harmony through fertility and renewal. It was like, as if the underworld was like the soil, which is underneath our feet. Soil is basically death. It's composted. It's all the leaves and animals and things that have died, and it gets repurposed as the soil. And soil is the womb in which new plants and new things are given life. And it was seen like this as the underworld, that the dead nourished life like compost. And the way that we fed our ancestors for them to have the energy to do this work was through offering. Offering could be song, it could be dance, it could be ritual, it could be burning of incense or pouring of libations or offering of meats or of blood. And we can get into a little bit of blood a little bit later because that tends to be a really hard one for Western minds to understand. I know it is for me too. But the idea here is the Andean culture wanted to prevent these ancestors becoming hungry, ravenous spirits, spirits that could take advantage of living hosts through addiction or mental health disorders or other afflictions. And so burial sites served as sacred places between worlds. Here we have another example of these Valdivia culture monoliths, one of the most ancient cultures in modern day Ecuador and in the Andes, on the coast actually. These monoliths appeared at sacred sites, high in the Apus or near pools or caves, again, portals to the other worlds. These would have been seen as ancestral spirits. They were guardian spirits, primordial spirits, that ritual offerings would have been laid directly right on the stone and asked these guardian spirits for protection, for healing, for guidance. And so these ancestral stone spirits were conduits between worlds. So here we have another example of a monolith from the same culture around the same time, this time in cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. And again, it would have been used as a stone ancestor for a ritual offering of food and drink to nourish the spirits, ensuring they remain protectors rather than turn parasitic. So going back to this idea of feeding, Gabor Mate talks about this in the realm of hungry ghosts, that if we don't adequately feed our ancestors in the other world with song, with prayer, with incense, with food, with drink, that they become hungry and in turn become parasitic and then start feeding off of us, our literal life energy force. And that can result in illness, depression, anxiety, illness, all sorts of things. And Martin Brechtel talks about this in this idea of like, if you don't give to nature in song and prayer and beauty, she will take in blood. So let's get into the blood sacrificing aspect. Every indigenous culture that I know of eventually is challenged with the idea if they want to grow and expand into empires. Many indigenous tribes do not choose to go this way because it's super spiritually expensive. And other indigenous tribes like the ancient Chinese, the ancient Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Aztec, the Mayan, the Inca, did choose to go down the way of empire. Now, let's go back to the metal tray and remind ourselves of how spiritually expensive making that metal tray was. You needed to give offerings to the mountain, the ore, the wood, the fire, the trees, the hammer. When you're busy building an empire, it becomes too time consuming to give all of these offerings. So empires are faced with a choice, and that choice is, well, we can wrap this up, all these little prayers and offerings, into larger, more expensive blood offerings. And so that's one understanding that many indigenous scholars propose as an understanding of ritual blood offering. It's not necessary, but if you go down the route of building an empire, then it becomes more advantageous. And before we get our Western notions all twisted up, I would offer and invite you to consider how we in contemporary society still make offerings of blood through sending our children to war, through other acts of violence. Okay, here we have two whistle bottles in the shape of serpents. Serpents and snakes were seen as guardians of the underworld, and they protected fertility and childbearing and abundance of agricultural goods. And these were dual functional. They would have held liquor, which would have been offered to the ancestors and to other spirits, and they were whistles. During rituals, religious specialists, shamans, would use them to summon spirits of regenerative forces from the underworld and called upon them in sacred ceremony. Here's a ceremonial pot in the shape of a gourd, of a pumpkin. Pumpkins were seen as wombs. They contained both the seeds of life and the ability to gestate life inside of them, like in a gourd. So would have also likely held offerings such as chicha, fermented maze drink, or sacred plant infusion teas, and they would have been used to honor fertility and agricultural and the continuity of life. Because the realm of the underworld, the realm of death, and the realm of fertility were so linked, were so closely associated with each other. These are some of my favorite figurines in the entire museum. Number one is of masculine and feminine. Again, duality, life, death, birth, regeneration, growth, stillness, light, darkness, up, down. So in a modern world, we associate the downward with something's wrong, something's bad, something's not as good. And upward, because we're obsessed with upward expansion and growth and progress, because we're an empire, we unfairly say that all things up are much better. And so this is where we get into this twisted notion of masculine and feminine. In Andean cultures, it was seen that women seated lower were closer to the underworld, closer to abundance, closer to fertility, closer to death and regeneration and darkness and mystery and soul. Soul comes from the underworld. And so they were guardians of the waters and guardians of childbirth, and that was their sacred role in society. In the masculine is taller. It's faced more upwards. It governs things like growth, expansion, and light, and things like this. This is why the masculine is holding an offering dish, because his sacred role is to appease and offer and build relationships with the upper world. And it required both of them equally to continue life. It wasn't one that was better than the other. It was that both were necessary, and their roles and unique roles and functions were necessary in the continuity of life. In figurine number 2, I think this is really best demonstrated. Here you have someone in childbirth. In labor. What you can't see on the other side is that this figurine also has male anatomy, has a penis, because this symbolized in Andean culture that the role of child rearing and birth was not just a feminine one, that it took both the seed of the masculine and the womb of the feminine to come together to create life, that it was these two poles, these two opposite forces coming together to make life. So chaos and order, light and darkness, death and life, or death and birth, up and down, the heavier, darker emotions and the lighter, more expressive emotions. All of this duality came together to give life. Here we come to the last artifact in this series, which is these offering containers. These would have been filled with offerings and buried with whoever died in their tomb. And this was a super important part of Andean wisdom traditions. The idea was that we wanted the dead to become nourishing ancestors. It was not assumed that every dead person would make it into the role of ancestor. Just as in life, it's not assumed that every teenager is going to amount to being a nourishing and regenerative elder in their society. It takes initiation, it takes experience, it takes wisdom and trial. But we require in life elders, and we require in death ancestors. And ancestors were thus the ones that could feed and nourish life going on here, and also assist the relatives in their operations and their day to day. And to ensure that the dead would be able to make the journey into the underworld successfully, you wanted to prepare your whole life to become spiritually juicy fruit and for the gods to feast off once you've passed. And that you were properly mourned and there were rituals around your death. And so there was a lot, just like the Egyptians, just like the Romans and the Greeks, just like the Aztecs, just like the Chinese, there were super extensive rituals and mourning and death, properly paying respect to the life that was lived here because it's so precious. And that helped ensure that they would become nourishing ancestors rather than parasitic ghosts. In our fifth and final section, this is on feasts, sacrifices, and offering. So we've talked a lot about the Andean cosmology around offering and sacrifice, that these were essential for maintaining ecological harmony, that food, drink, cocoa leaves, tobacco, metal objects, blood were all given to ancestors and spirits to maintain life. And then these offerings were buried alongside of people. But another really fun aspect, I think, of Andean culture and all indigenous culture is feasting, which is a little bit the opposite force or tension of offering, which is more like fasting. The elite sponsored fasts with abundance of food, with dancing and music and altered states of consciousness, of costumes, of ritual sexual practices. And these feasts were not just spiritual events, but were moments of communal unity. They brought families together, they formed political ties and economic ties, and they linked the living with their ancestors, ensuring the continuity of life. This is a much later artifact by the Jamacuacu culture. This is pre-Inca. The Inca really don't come on the scenes until the last 2 centuries before the conquest, so around 1300 to 1500. But these are pre-Incan cultures that the Incan culture would have been built off of. This is a shaman's table. It would have been used to uh, offer burnt incense or plants or other offerings. And in this way, the shaman and the religious specialists and the elite come together as patrons of the arts. In every indigenous culture mythology that I know, there are the same gods that govern public theater and performance are also the same gods that govern ritual, because there's this intersectionality between ritual and theater. In the ancient Greek world, theater was a offering. It was a public ceremony. It wasn't just watching and consuming a show. Same way in this culture, art and theater and ritual were all fused together into one. Um, Here in this table, you can see that there's frogs above all of these five gods. The frogs representing fertility, and so fertility again is an accent point in public ritual. Here is a puka or pucha. This is actually one of the only Incan artifacts in the entire museum. These were little vessels that would have poured libations. You would have put chicha in it and held it, and as you were walking, you would just like pour a little bit of chicha and offer this to the apus, offer this to the mountains and the waters, and to your ancestors. Here are caro cups. These are Incan vessels, ceremonial cups, that were used to drink sacred plants like the wachuma and the ayahuasca. These are one of only two artifacts in the entire museum that are from the Incan period, which is really important to note for a couple of reasons. One, because there are many pre-Columbian art museums across the world. And most of the artifacts are from the Incan Empire. And people assume that the Incan Empire played the most significant role in the Andean culture. And sure, it was a big and powerful empire, but it was built on many, many other indigenous cultures before them. And there are thousands of years of history of other Andean cultures and civilizations that were just as vibrant and thriving along the coasts, along the mountains and the jungles, and they often get overshadowed by the Inca. And the Inca are most well known in the European histories because that's who the Spanish encountered when they conquered South America. And I think it's really important that this museum actually highlights and centers other indigenous cultures that are not from the Incan Empire, because it shows the depth and longevity of the indigenous wisdom traditions that were here in South America long before the Inca. And it doesn't necessarily highlight the imperial pursuits of the Inca. But the Inca are cool, and here are caro cups, and these caro cups are super beautiful. If you go to the Andes today, you will see these caro cups used all over the place, and they're used to drink wachuma and ayahuasca. In the Andean cultures, especially in the Incan culture, wachuma and ayahuasca were two of the most revered plants. Wachuma, San Pedro cactus, embodies solar masculine energy, while ayahuasca represents the feminine forces of darkness and regeneration, and used in the jungle. Wachuma is used more in the Andes Mountains, and they reflect this cosmic duality that is center to Indian spirituality. And another really important aspect of these caro cups, like I said, if you go to the Andes today, you will see them widely used. And it points to that many of these cultures, Napo, the Quechua people, these are living, vibrant cultures that exist today. These are not just cultures that were conquested against the Spanish. That is an important piece of their history, but it's not the totality of their history. The Quechuan, there are millions of speakers of the Quechuan language, the old Incan language. And there are vibrant indigenous cultures in Central, South, and North America, and all over the world. And we'll talk more about that in the conclusion. Here are two masks by the Napo culture, a thriving present-day culture in native culture in present-day Ecuador and the Amazon. These ritual masks are, again, a really fine example of the intersectionality between public art and theater and ritual and ceremony. And like many other cultures around the world who use ritual masks, the Egyptians, the Dogon, the Shinto, Huariari of Indonesia. These masks would have been, as people would have put them on, they would have transformed, not metaphorically, as understood by these people, but, and not abstractly, but when you put the mask on, it transformed the wearer into an intermediary between the realms, an emissary between the ancestral realm and the present day realm, or the living realm. And so ritual dance and festivals connected the community to the dead and to the upper world and the lower world and the middle world. And it would have invoked protection and fertility and renewal. And through dance, through feasting, through ritual, through theater, it was these public arts that ensured that there was harmony between this world and that world. So I love to accentuate this elevated role of art, and that art was seen as necessary. It wasn't just beauty wasn't seen as just an add-on to life, and it wasn't reserved for just the rich or the elite. So, in the last exhibit hall of the museum, there are just a plethora of other artistic artifacts, like this pelican bottle. And I left my guests with a little test. They had to each go to a object that drew their attention, and after the tour, they had to give a presentation around why this specific object drew their attention, what about it drew their attention, and what they learned about Andean religious thought from this object. And so this is one that Maggie chose, and it's a pelican bottle. And birds are often seen as messengers between the worlds. They symbolize flight and access to the upper worlds. And this bottle would have been held, again, like most of the bottles in the collection, sacred liquors and liquids, and would have been given for a ritual offering. And I think it's like another really good prime example of how art and like functionality come together. Like this would have lived on someone's dining table, and it would have been buried with the person and help them transform into a nourishing ancestor. And it's painted with two colors to represent the duality of nature. So I think this bottle, I love that Maggie picked this because it, I think, in a really fun and playful and beautiful way, symbolizes all the conceptions of Andean pre-Columbian art and religious thinking. So thank you so much for joining me today. Just in a few words of conclusion, I hope that these objects, these power objects, really did come out as messengers from the past, from gifts from our ancestors, from collective wellsprings of memory. I think they're super important for our time, and I'm curious to hear. Please email me, please text me, please comment on how these objects may have touched you about our own times. History is not just something dead in the past, but it's a living collective memory, and that memory can help us point to different directions for the future. I hope that through pre-Columbian culture and these artifacts that we wove together, that we see that the material and the immaterial worlds are not separate, that art and theater and ritual and ceremony are inseparable parts of life and parts of culture. And my ultimate hope is that these that we revere every element of life, from the smallest ritual to the grandest ceremony, and that we see their purpose as part of cultural renewal, communal well-being, and regeneration of what our cultures are. That these weren't just symbolic gestures, that this was an art form, an act of maintaining the continuity of life by respecting and revering those who came before us, and ensuring the continuity of life continues after us in ways that are nourishing and regenerative. I also really wanted to thank just all these individual cultures and indigenous wisdom traditions in general. For a long time, I've been a student of indigenous wisdom traditions across the globe, from Africa to Europe, the mythologies of Asia, the cosmologies of American Indians and South America. And it's been a beautiful and rich study, a course of study through my whole life. And what I've learned is, and what I want to say here is that these cultures are not some relic of the past, that they're vibrant and living, and they have stuff to teach. They have important messages for us today. And they also point me back to my own indigenosity. There are patterns that exist across the whole indigenous worldview, patterns of respect and reciprocity, of feeding, of ancestor, of these connected worlds, and using spiritual forces to be able to heal and to guide life. And that existed in Europe too. And I want to remind my European friends and family and people of European ancestry that once too we were indigenous to our own land. And that was disrupted through imperial conquest of Rome and of their state religion of Christianity. And I'm not talking about mystic Christianity or first century Christianity. I'm talking about when Christianity was hijacked by the Roman Empire for imperial pursuits. And this pattern persists in other places too. The Inca did this to the Valdivia culture or the Napo culture. The Aztec did this to the other indigenous cultures that were around them. There's something here about empire that's really important to remember. There is the way of the wild and the way of the empire, and I would hope that this presentation shifted a little bit into the way of the wild. I'd like to thank the museum, Casa del Alabado in Quito, Ecuador. I'd like to thank photographer Brinson McGowan, my participants and guests on this tour, both virtual and physical, and Cabo at World Soundscape for putting this soundscape together. So thank you so much for your time and energy. And please feel free to reach out with questions or concerns or ideas or thoughts, or just to continue the dialogue. I think would be rich and beautiful.
Hey shutekutli tla sokamati in mishikayo yana wana yana hene yo wen shutekutli yana wana yana hey shutekutli tla sokamati in mishikayo yana wana yana hene yo wen